Hey, folks, we're just waiting for the audience to populate. So give us a minute. All right, I think that's enough time. You might hear some chirping in from my dog in the background. Please don't mind. She's a big fan of the forum chatter. So I'm Nick Ascoli. I am the senior product strategist as well as a member of the Flare research team. With us today is also Tammy Harper, who is our senior threat intelligence researcher with a strong focus and expertise in the ransomware ecosystem, which will be super valuable for today's discussion as they're deeply intermixed at this point. And Matthew Lavoie, who is the CTO and co-founder of Flare. Tammy and Matthew, thanks for being with us. So today's going to be a presentation, partially a history lesson and partially a discussion of what's going on in the modern forum landscape. Matthew will serve to moderate a little bit. I'll take us through the history, and Tammy will provide expertise in various forms along the way. Tammy, Matthew, anything you want to add before I start?
No, happy to be here. Really, I think it's kind of a follow up as well on our last webinar that got a lot of success on like the state of the dark web. So it's kind of the same idea where we deep dive a little bit more into one specific area of the dark web, which is farmer ecosystem. The reason why we decided to go with farmer ecosystem is they've got a lot of movement recently into that space. That you may be aware, but if you're not, that's a perfect opportunity to kind of a catch up on the last couple of months situation that evolved, that still honestly still continue to evolve as we speak.
Indeed. Cool. Well, thanks, Matthew. I'll kick us off. So a little bit of a history lesson. It's very tempting to talk about darknet drug markets in the forum conversation because the genesis of both are tied so deeply together. Same as the genesis of cryptocurrency and darknet markets also have a strong relationship. But a funny anecdote in the world of cybercrime is the first transaction that occurred online in the world of e-commerce at all was marijuana being traded between university students on ARPANET. So illicit transactions happening on approved or legitimate sources of internet traffic has always been a part of the internet. In recent decades, we've obviously seen through privacy technologies and various developments in several fields of cryptography, a rise of cybercrime in general due to the ease of accessibility that has, since the days of the 1970s and 80s, has dramatically simplified and become accessible to a relatively low tech audience with a very low barrier to entry, which we'll talk about. It's a big part of the current forum ecosystem, the ease of use. So the super early days here, the 90s is when cybercrime starts to take the form that it's in today in small nuggets, while the 80s and early 90s were marred by, mostly academic curiosity. There's a lot of really interesting books about what hacking looked like in the 90s. These were really small communities, think the early DEF CONs, and there were several interesting conferences in Vegas who are well documented in YouTube documentaries that you can go watch. But BBSs, personal blogs, chat rooms, these were small groups like Loft and CDC who operated, with usually some kind of ideological motivation, a lot of very academic, components to the group. And the exploration was as much about curiosity as it was about crime, crime was a less emphasis, though the things that were happening, many of them were technically illegal and would become technically illegal. Now, later in the 90s, drug markets would show up on the open internet. There was really no image of the Tor protocol that we have today, though the Tor project had existed for several decades before the browser launched. A lot of the transactions that happened in the early days of the cybercrime world were in fiat currencies traded through traditional banking systems through what would attempt to be anonymous accounts. Now, the 2000s, especially the later 2000s, are when cybercrime and the forum ecosystem start to take the shape that they have now. On the right, you'll see this is a screenshot from Shadow Crew, which was one of the more prominent early forums. The posts that are in this screenshot, this is a copy from the Internet Archive. You can see these posts still in the Internet Archive, are from 2002, right? This is early 2000 cybercrime. And an interesting anecdote here is the actual structure of this forum is extremely similar to the forums you see today. Browsing this forum feels like browsing breached forums or Exploit.in or any of the forums that exist now. It's striking how things change and yet very much stay the same. So Shadow Crew, another forum called Darkode, there's several that emerged and had audiences in the thousands, not in the hundreds of thousands or millions like there are today on the major forums, but had small, passionate communities of cyber criminals coming together from all over the world. Now, on the right, you'll see this is one of the first public seizure notifications when Shadow Crew was taken over by I believe it was the Secret Service. So this is one of the earlier iterations of the seizure pages you see today, which are now have a lot more art behind them, a lot more investment. But this is just an interesting look at the how the anatomy of them has changed over time. And 2008 marks a pretty significant change. So two things happened in 2008 that are very important. The launch of the Tor browser. The Tor as a protocol and as a project had been around for a very long time, but inaccessible to people broadly, a wider, less technical audience. And the Tor browser launches, the development starts in late 2008 and it launches in 2009 for a web browser that uses the onion routing protocol to anonymize web traffic. And the creation of Bitcoin, which again, started in late 2008, actually launches in 2009 to enable anonymous web transactions, which it's, again, very tempting to talk about drug markets because they're deeply intertwined at this point, which is the Silk Road, is certainly intermixed with the rise in the popularity of Bitcoin and the Tor browser, which would both feed into the cybercrime communities later.
Nick, an interesting point on this one is, for example, like I2P, which is another network that is anonymized network, haven't took off. And part of the reason why it haven't took off, it's maybe due to the fact that they didn't have like a browser or really a deployment that make it easy to use. It's still out there, still being used. It was actually even used when there was some disruption in DDoS on the Tor browser. There's some community that moved to I2P, but really never took the scale of Tor. And the other thing that we see, and I'm maybe coming a little bit ahead of the presentation, is we see a shift even recently from Tor to Clear Web. So we see more and more community that are not necessarily only accessible to Tor, but also to a modern browser through the normal, what we'll call the normal internet here, without necessarily having to pass through an anonymized, somewhat slow network.
Absolutely, yeah. That is the forums, especially in the early and mid 2000s, and very much still so today, are on the clear web and were on the clear web. So the hiding behind Tor has not always been popular, but Tor has enabled a level of privacy that was previously inaccessible and has been extremely popular. And to your point, it's because of the browser. The launch of a portable executable that someone can download and install, with a couple clicks, is a huge part of the success of the project and its adoption in privacy communities and cybercrime communities. So I'm going to skip ahead quite a bit. There's a lot of interesting things that happen in the 2010s and early 2000s, but the ecosystem starts to take the shape that it is today in the most resembling sense in 2015 with the launch of raid forums. Now, the word raid in raid forums is what is literal. The community emerged from there were a lot of YouTube channels in the 2010 to 2015 of YouTube where people would raid live streamers, primarily on Twitch. and they would prank them. They would convince them to do things. They would pretend to be Twitch support. They would do all manner of pranks, which went from physical pranks like trying to convince streamers to put their laptops in a microwave to more cyber, more computer-based pranks, which were trying to get someone to install something like a wiper on their device, or to delete System 32 while live on camera, which led to scripts showing up on raid forums to enable that kind of activity. So originally, raid forums is a place for people to organize raids of streamers, typically with some flavor of malintent. And what you're seeing on the right is what raid forums looked like very much in the early days, before cybercrime had largely proliferated on it. Cybercrime starts to creep in around the days that I'm talking about, where sabotage is part of the goal of a successful raid, is getting the streamer to do something that impacts them in a way that's noticeable or negative, which is followed by the development on the forum of specific places for sharing doxing techniques and databases to find information about live streamers, usernames and passwords from leaked DBs, addresses, all manner of things. And this is when forum members start to exchange TTPs, start to exchange breach databases so that they can try and find streamers' content in them. And then this is sort of shortly after that, raid forums just becomes the ground zero. People from disparate cybercrime communities all over the place start joining raid forums and sharing their breach databases there. This is part of raid forums' actual rise to prominence. So after a very, very long, and in the cybercrime community, very successful run as the place to go for leaks and breaches, the creator of the forum, Omnipotent, who is identified as Portuguese citizen, was arrested in an operation targeting specifically Omnipotent. After the fall of raid forums, the raid forums membership was huge when it fell, just north of 500,000 members. So in the wake of it, a lot of forums come and go. Nothing really takes the public's attention quite like raid forums did, and there's a sort of era where all of the membership is sitting in a sort of purgatory, and then breach forums comes to head by a very prominent member of raid forums, Pompomperin, who decides to take the reins and create a stopgap, breach forums, which ends up actually filling the void successfully. Now, before we talk about breach forums, Tammy, Matthew, anything to add?
I also wanted just to briefly say that Omnipotent, Diogo, was only 14 years old when he started raid forums. And this is really, I think, this age bracket is something that we're going to see, I think, only continue throughout these forums. This is the age where you're in high school. This is the age where you're really prone to trolling and love pranking things and stuff like that. And not being able to see being like having the veil of anonymity and being in a community like this, like we call it breach culture, where you can believe that you're safe to conduct these acts, these criminal acts, is really, really interesting. So also when it comes to Pompompurin, Pompompurin was a data hoarder and had amassed quite an impressive amount of data, which was used to basically initially seed and supply the breach CDN that we see it today. And another thing that's really interesting is when Connor, or Pompompurin Connor Fitzpatrick, was committing these crimes, he's notorious for impersonating FBI. He's notorious for his breach on Robinhood, the trading platform. So these are high-level threat actors that are first and foremost motivated by breach culture, and secondly by trolling.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think if you're interested at all in the psychology of the demographics of these forums, it can really be traced back to Raid. This is a young culture of people very online and very in tune with things like live streaming. And this ends up being a feeder into cybercrime. But you'll notice, and we'll talk about arrests later, but a striking difference between arrests for darknet markets and arrests for forums is forum owners are very young. Forum operators and owners and people who exchange and steal this data are usually very young adults, versus market operators can be, often are also young adults, but can be much older members of criminal syndicates that also operate kinetically in person and online. So the audience of raid forums that was introduced to cybercrime is very young. And, in places like breach forums today, in groups like Scattered Spider, there's still a heavy, a lot of youth presence in the groups and recruitment on very online places for this kind of audience. So breach forums has a pretty short run in the forum world. Many forums are still around today that have been around since 2015, 2016. Breach forums falls just a year after launch in March 2023. The administrator of the forum, as Tammy mentioned, Connor Fitzpatrick, was age 20 when he was arrested, which means when he was very active on raid forums, this was a very young person. At the time of the shutdown, breach forums was very large, still hadn't reached the sort of critical mass of raid forums, but the membership was around 340,000. And Palm was the only person arrested in this first operation, which left a little bit of a gap. Now, these gaps existed after raid forums. These gaps have existed several times and will exist several times. And in each scenario, people attempt to take the throne. There were folks from secret forums and several other forums trying to recruit the sort of like uprooted and rudderless members of the forums who were looking for a new home. A very prominent threat actor who's very active today, US DoD, who is not the actual Department of Defense, but is a prominent member of many forums, considered starting a forum, which did not end up gaining prominence. But prominent members of the forum, just as Pom Pom Purin did after raid forums, prominent members of breach forums, the first one, considered and attempted several projects which never really garnered steam.
Yeah.
So Matthew.
Yeah, just before we move on, we have a really good question in the chat, and I think it's a good opportunity to take it to the group here. Is how does this forum speed up to an audience of 500,000 plus member in Tor that we know there's no formal search engine? I think my honest answer would be there's a lot of different group and sharing information group. There's some wiki, there's some resources out there that could be used. I don't know if you want to comment or adds up on this.
I mean, Tammy, I'd love your insight. I think the thing is, for the several 100,000 members, like breach forums now, like raid forums for a very long time, they actually do have, they are indexed by Google. Maybe they have, the actual thread archival is not possible. They've got, prevention in place for that. But if you look up, if a cyber criminal was interested in getting to raid forums and searched it on Google, for most of raid forums' existence, a link to raid forums would pop up, the clear web link to the raid forum site. Now there are lots of onion. Oh, go ahead, Tammy.
So I was also going to mention really quickly that breach forums is also on the clear web, and these communities are global as well. There was a very interesting graph that was a set of graphs that was created by a user on Telegram regarding the breach data set that had been leaked, like the database of breach V1. So this is the breached forums V1 database from 2022. So when you look at all of the information, the last used IP address for most of the accounts that were logging into breach forums in 2022 originated from Indonesia, United States #2, UK, Hong Kong, and so on. So this is a global website. It's not necessarily, yes, it's English speaking, but it's not necessarily North American or Western. This is a global website. And so when we see these websites going 300,000, 500,000 members, This is just because of the sheer popularity of what they're doing and the target demographic that they're targeting. Also, a lot of bots.
Yeah, lots of bots. And there were a lot of mainstream sources say even if a prominent forum decided to go only Onion, take down their Clear websites, remove all the mirrors, and only have an Onion. There were, many of them have been banned at this point. There were a lot of, like Reddit has membership in the many millions at this point. There were several prominent subreddits for Onion link updates, for darknet markets, for dark web markets, for cybercrime forums, where people would exchange the active and new links. So Reddit, a very accessible place, a very searchable place. It was very easy at the time to find links to whatever darknet market or forum you were looking for, not through some, you don't really have to dig too far to find it. It's just there on Reddit.
I think it's kind of a somewhat of a misconception that like the dark web is a lot of like scattered small community, as like what we see in terms of like natural requirement or needs for the different cyber criminals is to be able to reach out to a broader community. So what we usually observe is like the major community on the dark web does represent the vast majority of the volume that is accessible out there. So we kind of see as well those like big forums being like the winners takes out, and we saw it as well into the market, into other situation where there's always this kind of like one important site that take most of the volume in the market space, in the forum space, and like even in the ransomware group, we saw some kind of like consolidation as well, without getting too much into the details. But that's part of the explanation why we have one community that takes most of the volume. And when that community is being breached, being seized, we see a lot of people trying to find what's the next one and moving on to the next one.
Yep. I see some mentions in the chat about Telegram and Discord. So there's a question, did Telegram play a role in popularizing these forums? I don't know that Telegram necessarily increased the popularity of the forums, but has certainly improved the ability for the populations to move together and to stay informed. There's been very, very few seizures or banning of groups on Telegram. The Breach Forums group, one of the more prominent Breach Forums group, was seized, and Shiny Hunters, who was a prominent member of the forum, who ends up becoming the administrator shortly after, which we'll get into in a minute, their account was banned. And that's kind of it. Telegram, up to this point, has been a relatively faultless place for cyber criminals to communicate. So it's certainly made the ease of recovering much higher. And honestly, a lot of things happen on Telegram that also happen on the forums. It's like the shout box, which we'll get into later. It's like a forum shout box, but people post leaks in the forums adjacent Telegram group. People post dumps, people sell access. A lot of the same things happen in these chat apps, but they don't get the same level of coverage as they would if you post them on the forum. So a lot of people will either cross-post both or just post on the forum. But the relationship between Telegram specifically and the forums is inseparable right now. Discord is also very prominent, but Telegram is certainly the most
I also
popular.
wanted to just make a quick point on Telegram. We're starting to see forums that operate exclusively on Telegram. So Telegram has the option of creating forums. So we are starting to see a lot of those. One prominent forum that we are monitoring is UserSec. UserSec has a forum based on Telegram, and that allows individuals to communicate and continue operating as if they were on the ClearWeb forum.
Cool. So moving on, what do things look like now? Breach Sense has relaunched. Baphomet specifically relaunched it after the first fall. So this is Breach 2.0. And then Baphomet is arrested and the forum is re-seized. There's no actual name or public anything that's been said by law enforcement about the arrest of Baphomet. However, when they re-seized the site, they put his username behind bars. And again, Shiny, who we mentioned before, posted in the breach telegram that they can confirm that Baphomet has been arrested. This is still kind of an up in the air thing. I would not take them at their word on this. I would wait to see how this develops, if charges are brought, if anything is made public. But for now, it's pure speculation. However, Shiny Hunters, after the supposed alleged arrest of Baphomet, re-establishes the forum. And they've got several posts. One of them I have here of them basically being tired of running it. They're constantly under scrutiny. They feel that people are too suspicious of them as being compromised by law enforcement, and they pass the torch. So they are no longer the administrator of the forum, and they've passed ownership of Breach Forums to someone else. And as of today, Breach Forums is still active, and in my anecdotal opinion, is operating at a volume of leaks, of prominent leaks, that is previously unseen. The peak days of raid forums and the peak days of Breach 1 and 2 saw absolutely massive damaging incidents relatively regularly. But the scale at which the threat actors on these forums are leaking things, you don't have to look far for news stories about these on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, is unprecedented compared to volume before, and is sort of marking an era of leaks. The increased sassification of lots of digital infrastructure has led to many databases that previously sat, in a data center with no clear route to the internet, have left services like these very online and susceptible to the probing, the low-level reconnaissance and probing that exposes them that these threat actors and sort of commodity cyber criminals are able to engage in. Now, the forum landscape is not just Breach forums. It's not just the fallout of raid forums. There are hundreds of cybercrime forums that have memberships in the thousands, and there are dozens, maybe more, who have membership in the hundreds of thousands and millions. So the ecosystem goes far beyond those. It just so happens that a lot of the more prominent leaks these days end up getting posted to Breach forums. However, it's the most popular in the English language community. In the Russian language community, Exploit.in and XSS are two of the most popular. Exploit.in focuses on, there's a lot of financial incentive there, but hacking and malware in general. XSS is a lot of the same, a lot more, a lot of databases, DB leaks, and ULP leaks, username, login, and password leaks, get posted to XSS. So these are two very, very prominent, very large, primarily Russian language forums. Dread is another very popular location. Dread is sort of the Reddit of the dark web, which, like I said, there were several Reddit communities that have been banned that were the place for people to share updated Onion links. Dread ends up being the answer to that question once those subreddits are banned. Dread takes over as the place for people to discuss who are reputable vendors, what are the new links, what's going on with the markets, what's going on with law enforcement activity. And shortly after Dread's creation, the adjacent cybercrime communities end up creating the equivalent of subreddits on Dread for hacking, for malware, for cybercrime in general, for trading data. So it was originally focused mostly on darknet markets, still very much is, but has a strong cybercrime component to it. And then Nulled is one of the longest standing forums, which I've read in more than one place that the membership is in several million, the most recent figure, 3 million, which is a ton of people, right? Nulled is a clear web forum that has a massive, massive audience even when compared against some of the largest forums that have ever come around. So the audience here is strong, the community is strong, and it's been around for a very long time. But you don't see it in the news nearly as much anymore, as a lot of the prominent, Breach, actual Breach community folks operate on Breach forums specifically. Anything to add on the landscape, Tammy and Matthew?
Nope, not on my side.
Cool.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the anatomy of forums. This is what we're going to talk about here can basically be extended to every forum out there. It's all they all not only look very, very similar, but operate very, very similar. The first thing we'll talk about in the forum anatomy is the forum itself, and that is the place where threads exist. A forum thread is where people discuss whatever the topic is, whatever the post is, whatever the database is, relatively openly. So this is the Breach Forums Stealer Log channel as an example. This is where people go to post Stealer logs. We've talked and we'll talk a lot in the future about the Stealer Log ecosystem, very much living in Telegram, primarily at the moment, but almost all of the forums have a Stealer Log component where people can go and trade ULPs or summaries from Stealer logs that they have. So it does remain a strong source. This is Ramp's Ransomware as a Service Partner Program sub forum. So basically, if there is a subcomponent of cybercrime like RAS, like phishing kits, like Stealer logs, there is a sub forum on all of these major forums to serve as the specific place to go to discuss whatever that is. After that, another important thing is the shout box. Here you'll see very prominent member of several communities, mostly breach forums at this point, Intel Broker, discussing their motives behind a major incident, which was they claimed for fun. Again, this speaks to what the culture is at the moment. There is increasing financial motivation among threat actors and a lot more activity on the leak markets. But overwhelmingly, these leaks are still shared for free. And you'll see the shout box on Ramp, which is one of the prominent, primarily Russian language, but also English speaking forums. There's a lot of both on those. The shout box looks the same, right? These are the point is, once you're an authenticated user, you can go type in the shout box, and the shout box is a rolling stream chat where anyone can say anything. It's not within a sub forum. It's not about a specific topic. It's just general chatter. A lot of this happens now in the dedicated forum Telegram groups, but just as much of it still happens in the shout boxes. Now, the marketplaces are subcomponents of the forums where exchanges happen. So the database, the leaks, all of the different, even the Stealer logs thing that I showed, all of those locations are generally free. The data that is posted there is freely available to all users. Maybe they have to exchange a small amount of credits on the forum, which there's a way to get credits without buying them, which is by being active on the forum itself. So not always an exchange of money necessarily, but you can also, users also are known to buy credits. But the marketplaces are where people are selling either access or leaked databases overwhelmingly. Sometimes you'll see exploits. These are not nation state level 0 days. Maybe occasionally one will show up. Overwhelmingly, these are very low level exploits for known CVEs. And mostly we're talking about data leaks and breach data being sold on these marketplaces, usually with the use of a middleman. So the middleman services offered on these forums are typically offered not only by the forum itself, but it is customary on these forums that whoever the administrator is at the time is typically, this is not necessarily like a rule, but it was a custom under Omnipotent. It was a custom under Pompompurin that the owner of the forum acts as the key agent of escrow, where when a significant database is being sold, a significant leak is being sold for a high dollar value, the administrator will be the middleman of the transaction, a third party to sit between the actual exchange of money, to not only validate the data, to say that the threat actor is selling what they think they're selling and that the data is real, is not recycled, is not made up. Once that's been confirmed by the middleman, they can arrange payment between the middleman such that the person buying and the person selling are not interacting directly. Now, in terms of anatomy, that's it on forums. I'm going to talk about the relationship between forums and markets as of now. But before that, Tammy, Matthew, anything you want to add or discuss?
No, I think the link with the different market will be good. I think going forward, I think we have some slide, but really we'll discuss like the different relationship between the ransomware and the market. But on my side, I'll let the floor to Tammy. I think Tammy could have better insight than me on that.
One last point I want to mention before we get into the ransomware is the forum wars. So it's interesting because the operators behind the admins behind the forums have to protect themselves and, to an extension, the community of law enforcement. So there is this level of responsibility of like trying to protect their databases, protect like the amount of information that they process and the logs that they keep. And what's interesting is that not only do they have to worry about law enforcement, they also have to worry about other factions and other groups of threat actors from within the forum, or like we can get into this a little bit later as well, or other forums. So we've seen like Oni forums attacking breach forums. We've seen dark forums attacking Oni forums attacking breach. The whole is these are called forum wars. And what's interesting is when these databases leak, they can put a lot of threat actors at jeopardy. Just recently, we saw breach forums V1 2022, the entire database, including private messages, financial transactions, and IPs of registration and last seen, including emails and passwords of all of these threat actors, just completely freely available. So this is interesting because now, like, for example, if we looked at the database and we saw Intel Broker was part of this database, we looked at the registration IP address, which was a server in Atlanta, a VPN server. And then we saw a VPN server being used as the last seen out of Montreal, Quebec, Canada. And that was from Mulvad. So that is it gives you insight, and you have to, when you're using these platforms in an investigation, not only are you in there with criminals, but you also have to be careful that other criminals are out there against you as well.
Yeah, that made me think as well, Tammy, is when those forums was breached, we saw a lot of discussion between the admin of like who had access to the database, like who was given. There's a lot of discussion and tension between I want to help you manage a forum, I want to have access to the full database, I want to be admin, no, you can't. So there's all kind of like when a forum is seized, there's a lot of discussion that happened about like who had access to what and what is the risk for other cyber criminals. So we really see like there's a lot of discussion, and this is why because all of this rely to credibility. And when we say at first that usually the winner takes out, to be the most prominent player in the space, you need to be trustable by the other cyber criminals or the other community out there. Meaning like those incident of like there's maybe multiple people having access to the infrastructure is definitely some strike that community will have a hard time recovering and basically establish themselves as a main community going forward.
That's a great point. Just quickly on that as well, when you mentioned specifically like having access to someone having access to the database of the forum, we saw that recently with Baphomet. So before Baphomet was arrested, which was an admin of breach forums, and before Baphomet was recognized as someone who was compromised, Baphomet had originally reached out to Astounding. Astounding is the admin of secret forums and black forums, and basically has said, hey, quote unquote, bro, I can help you manage and make sure that and secure your backend for these two servers. And Astounding said, no, we don't need you. We don't want to do that. And just a few weeks later, Baphomet was arrested. So it really shows you like how far back was a user compromised? Like, was Astounding talking with law enforcement at that point, which is really, really interesting.
Yeah, that is a great point, and speaks to, there's not a lot of literature about this necessarily, but from what we see, on the research team, there has been a significant disruption in trust among what were previously tight-knit communities on the dark web, including prominent actors who have, in the last several months, retired under pressure of the the sort of lack of the chaos that has emerged in the second and sort of third fall and ownership change of Breach Forums. There was, in the early days of Breach Forums, with Pom Pom Purin as the owner and administrator, there was a much stronger inherent sense of trust, not only among the forum, but among other groups that operated adjacent to the forum, with the several law enforcement operations that have targeted not only Pom, but also Baphomet, and also actors in adjacent ransomware communities, which we don't cover on these slides, but there have been a couple major busts in the ransomware world under Project or Operation Endgame, which is a like multinational cooperative law enforcement operation to take down several different cybercrime communities. The trust has been broken and has not been earned back. Everyone thinks everyone is compromised. Really, no one is safe right now. It doesn't mean that the threat actors aren't still very active, but there is a latent sense of suspicion that exists in the fallout of the forums themselves. So forums and marketplaces have always had a strong relationship, in that, honestly, a lot of forums, several forums, emerged as places to discuss what was going on markets. And a lot of forums sort of were markets in a quiet sense, where they were places to discuss drugs and illicit goods, and people would just end up, by discussion, selling things to each other, which is the genesis for the markets that would emerge afterwards in the first place. Now, a lot of these markets are specifically tied to cybercrime, not only because they're selling goods, hard goods, over the internet illegally, but a lot of these markets people will sell cybercrime services and data in the same way that they sell them on markets on these forums, albeit less popularly than on the forums themselves. But a lot of these markets are plagued with a lot of cybercrime activity and sales and exchanges, just as they are drugs, contraband, and all manner of things. Now, law enforcement's targeting of markets has looked a lot different than law enforcement's targeting of forums. I think it's a lot easier generally in the prosecutions we've seen in markets to find market operators, because they're taking a lot more risk with their physical person, going to places to pick up products, going to places to drop off products, mailing things internationally or across state lines, opens them up to a lot more risk and dramatically changes their sort of digital footprint. This is a list of operations that have targeted overwhelmingly markets. But while a lot of these are considered cybercrime arrests, these were arrests of market operators, owners, administrators, and these are spanning there's kind of been one major one every year or 2 years, dating back to 2015 and honestly earlier. There's several from earlier. So the operations that have successfully led to hundreds of arrests in the darknet market community have not affected the forum world as much, but one small arrest in the forum world creates shockwaves that is not necessarily equated in the market ecosystem. Whereas when a market falls, a new one pops up like that, and the market community shifts over there and continues buying and selling drugs, with strong resilience, maybe is the word. And they learn the lessons from the last one and make changes. So
I wanted to say this as well in terms of trust, which is very important. There have been, so this was in 2023, there was a forum called Exposed. And Exposed was originally started off as in the sort of like vacuum of breach forums. And this was one of the competitors that was rising up quickly. They were saying like, you can post about and talk about ransomware here. You can do pretty much anything you want. The owner of Exposed was someone called impotent, which was probably a jab at omnipotent. But Exposed was really trying to really like gear up in terms of what it was doing. But it turned out that not even a month or two after it started, it shut down. Now, what all of that database that it was able to acquire, what happens with this? And then we saw it rebrand to Ransom VC. Ransom VC got notoriously known to become sort of connected to false breaches or making a statement and claiming a victim when that actually wasn't entirely the truth about where that data came from. So you can't even trust like those types of forums. And then this sort of like evolves and gets connected to other data extortion groups that we're monitoring that actually like turn out to be complete scams, targeting victims, but also the community as well.
Indeed. So, okay, we've talked about the forums, the forum and market relationship. Now, a very interesting relationship that Tammy can provide a lot of insight into is the forum to ransomware relationship, ransomware affiliates, ransomware programs, ransomware as a service, and the recruitment of said affiliates. So, Tammy, I will let you take over and walk us through forums and ransomware groups.
Absolutely. So, depending on the forum that you are on, not every single forum will allow you to openly discuss ransomware operations, or even anything that could be construed to be ransomware. So something like an encryptor and a decryptor. So forums like XSS, for example, vehemently ban this type of discussion. So, which is funny because on XSS, there's a thread which has pretty much within the industry been recognized as one of the better like sources of ransomware links, like onion links. And it's like, so I've seen some threat actors drop it in that thread, and that is how they advertise their new RAS, even though we're not supposed to be talking about RAS on XSS, which is pretty funny. But regardless, back to the point, recruitment of ransomware is a very, very interesting thing. So what we'll see is on these forums, you'll see someone post a advert. These adverts break down the technical abilities of their ransomware, their payload, and also of the operation. So how the business is structured, because a lot of these ransomware operations are structured as a business, and the structure is very similar to an MLM. So multi-level marketing operation, where you'll see affiliates basically get a cut of the revenue and the ransom that they're able to bring in. And then there's always, now we're seeing, because of this mistrust that we recently, what we talked to previously, so there's a lot of groups that will ask you to pay upfront. And so what happens is, like, for example, Lockbit and recently Ransom Hub, they will ask you to put in $5,000 to up to $50,000 upfront so that you can enter the game and enter their ransomware as a service operation. And then from there, you can basically say, if you hit someone and you successfully extort a ransom out of that victim, you can deduct, they'll deduct that payment, the upfront payment from it, so you can get some money back. So when we're looking at ransomware affiliates and how they are recruited on the forums, we see basically the adverts, and then basically they're saying, okay, I'm looking for red teamers, I'm looking for pen testers, I'm looking for OSINTers, I'm looking for, so recently there was a group, and that group basically was also advertising not only for red teamers and OSINTers, but they were also looking for stalkers and OSINTers. And so we're now starting to see again, well, we started to see this in 2022, and we saw this a little bit in 2023 as well, but we're seeing two groups now in 2024 so far advertise VAS, which is violence as a service. And this is tied into their OSINT and their stalking and their mailing and calling and their phoning capabilities. So the ransomware ecosystem is evolving, it's changing, and so it's only getting harder. How do people get paid in this whole ecosystem? So it's one way is the splits. And the splits are usually 70-30. So 70% goes to the affiliate, 30% goes to the operators, but that can change 80-20. 80 to the operators and so the affiliates, and then 20 to the operators. That is the most common split we see. And that is basically like what Lockbit is under right now. And then we see 90 and 10. So that's like something like Ransom Hub or APT 73. Which is extremely, extremely attractive. Like if you're doing a ransom of $1 million, and then you can basically get 90%, the affiliate is more likely to join that RAS instead of another competing RAS. So affiliate percentages is something that the groups compete over. It's a competitive front. But we're seeing more and more groups just posting right now and saying like, hey, we're looking for partnerships. We want to hire more and more people. It's really through affiliate and commission based. So there's no salaries involved or anything like that. And we want to see more people. We want to have more people on our teams.
Perfect. Can you speak a little bit about what is the multi-level marketing operation? What do you mean by similar, like the RASO structure to multi-level marketing? Do you mean like, do you have different commission for the different type of people or different level of skill set? Like entry level, like affiliate get like lower commission as you grow into like proving yourself as a potential skill ransomware like affiliate, you get like more advantage. Is that what you mean there?
Yeah, absolutely. So the whole world of ransomware. So when you're trying to get into a ransomware, there's really like two main ways of getting in. The first way is through someone vouching for you. So that is one way of saying like, okay, I vouch for this person, and if something happens, I will take the risk of onboarding this person. The second way is through deposit. And so what we see is when we make a deposit, ranging from anything really $500, $5,000, $50,000, and basically that is held in their wallets, and you get that back on your first job or however much you're able to extort. So what we're seeing is that depending on your repertoire, on your resume, on your skill set, you are able to command a better affiliate, like a split. We're seeing affiliates who say, hey, I have a team, I have infrastructure, I have my tools, can command a higher and a more favorable split. If you're saying, look, I'm going to need you to host the data, I'm going to need you to, I'm going to need your tools, not only just the encryptor, but I'm going to need like your stealers, I'm going to need like all of your stuff. And on top of that, I want you to do negotiations for me. Then your split is that's more work for the operators, and then that's going to go down. So you're not in terms of what you bring to the table is not as attractive anymore.
Sounds good. Anything, Nick, you want to add, or we move to the next slide? Okay, perfect.
I think next slide. We're limited on time, and I'd love Tammy to cover Star Fraud.
So Star Fraud chat is one of the major Telegram channels that we are monitoring at Flare. And this chat has been linked to activity that Scattered Spider has been responsible for. I see a lot of people, and myself included, I'm guilty of saying that this is the Scattered Spider chat. This is not the case. It is a Star Fraud chat, and it has some Scattered Spider activity in it. So what we see here is active recruitment of various different services. So these services are really geared towards social ends or social engineering. And this is really in terms of phishing, spear phishing, MFA fatigue. We see others just carding, overall, the general umbrella of fraud. And it's pretty fascinating to see that this is openly discussed. These are adverts. These are small bulletins saying, hey, I'm looking for this type of person. And sometimes they're saying, hey, I need a woman to do this because I need you to call in and basically impersonate a woman. I need you to impersonate this type of stuff. Really fascinating on that front. and or they're basically saying, hey, I need someone with this type of accent, or hey, I need this type of knowledge, of specific knowledge on a background, to basically impersonate and defeat MFA questions. So this chat is really, really interesting.
Indeed it is. And Scattered Spider as a group is very interesting. They're a threat group tracked by pretty much every prominent research organization. The interesting thing about them is, like a lot of the major English-speaking forums right now, they have a strong U.S. presence, which a lot of the groups we see emerge in the ransomware world, there is often a U.S. component to it, but there's a lot of activity from South America, a lot of activity from Eastern Europe, and in affiliate programs, in recruitment, in threat groups that are responsible for major incidents, as Scattered Spider has been attributed to several times already. It's less common that you see a lot of membership in the United States, usually a handful, but the US and UK has been associated with a strong amount of the membership, and it is a big group. I believe the FBI last projected about 1,000 members, maybe a little north of 1,000. So it's a large group. It is an interesting one to watch, and we will see how that develops. Now, I will open the floor to the audience for Q&A. I know there's not much time, but if you have anything, we would love to hear it. We'll scroll through the chat and see if there's anything in there that we missed. But please throw some questions in, and we will take some time to address them.
I can start with one question from Stuart in the chat of, do we see this breakup of trust cause division of group, or just a tighter structure in the big hitter of the ecosystem? That's when we're talking about the breach of, the disclosure in the database of Breach Forum V1. To that point, I think everyone is a little bit like, in terms of cyber criminals, I think a lot of those actors are on the watch of, because there is certainty of who had a good OPSEC and who didn't have a good OPSEC, and that's kind of I think create a little bit of lack of trust between actor. And I think that this is a good example of how the law enforcement was able to disrupt the farmer ecosystem, as they were able to back in the days disrupt some of the illicit market. So I think the operation was successful with Bahamut, and I think I'm curious I'll just send it back since we have only so many minutes left. Tammy and Nick, do you have any insight you want to add on that question?
Yeah, I think the breakups in terms of division within groups, I haven't seen a whole lot of that, like CN, like SiegeSec before it wrapped up, and like a lot of the smaller groups that operate on the forums, they haven't necessarily broken up. They, a lot of them have their own little blogs or their own sub places where they chat, and usually it's more you see fighting from between small groups than small groups of like the tight knit, like you say in your question, Stuart, heavy hitter groups. Like, we don't necessarily see them breaking up in Breach Forums 1 and in Breach Forums 3. The same small groups, the same key users have been working together and leaking things together, even with the coming and going of administrators and among several arrests. So there is a hint of resilience among the more prominent groups and the heavy hitter groups and the groups that are very public and maintain their own blogs.
In 1 minute, there's a good question for Tammy. How often do you see affiliates starting their own business? I think we're talking about ransomware as a service here.
So we see a lot of groups spin up and then dissolve. So for example, a few months ago, we saw a group called APOS. APOS was a very well organized RAS. We saw this as well with SOGLAV. So APOS, when it came onto the scene, it was very structured. Their builder was extremely well organized with extensive documentation, and they basically just dropped off the face of the earth. So this was an individual who clearly had experience And basically, when they launched their first DLS, so dedicated leak site or dark web leak site, they hosted on Notion, and that was immediately taken down. And basically, we have not really seen any attempt at resurrecting that project. Same thing with Slowglav. Slowglav was originally a group who came out strong, made a lot of adverts and affiliate and saying like, hey, we can hire, we can do all of this stuff. And a few months later, after a total of 64 systems encrypted, have basically called it quits. So we're seeing a lot of groups spin up, do a few breaches, and then spin down. We don't know if this is just because they were looking at a payout and now they have the money and then they're shutting down, or is it just because of the sheer complexity of running your own operating RAS operation and just seeing the risk is too high for what they're getting out of it and then shutting down.
Perfect. I think we're on time for that webinar. Thank you very much for attending the webinar. Thank you, Tammy. Thank you, Nick, for your insight in the session. As it was said in the chat, this session was recorded and will be available on our social media as well. Any famous last word from Tammy, Nick?
No, thanks everyone for coming. Hope you enjoyed, and we will see you on the next one.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Have a good one.